You're watching Neon Gods. Welcome to the first official episode of Sting, Religion, and the Meaning of Life. In this video, we begin the series with a look at Sting's childhood, his religious upbringing, his difficult family life, his hometown of Wallsend, how being an altar boy appealed to his inner performer, and his time in Catholic schools, the good, the bad, and the ugly. From the Latin Mass to mysticism and memorized catechism, from rosaries to rebellion, from Mary Star of the Sea to a cane-lashing memory, this is the story of Sting's lifelong fascination and lifelong problem with religion. Let's just start with some basics about Sting's childhood. I don't need to give his whole biography. You can read his memoir, Broken Music, for more detail. But I do want to touch on some of the basics that we'll need to know for our focus on religion. So, Sting, or Gordon Matthew Sumner, was born in 1951 in Wallsend, England, which is basically a suburb of Newcastle upon Tyne. At that time, it was more of its own town, but still connected to Newcastle. This was historically part of the Northumbria region in the medieval period, then later called Northumberland after the Norman conquest. The region had been invaded by Vikings several times in the early medieval period. So Wallsend derives its name from the fact that it was literally the end of the Roman Empire, at least the northernmost point up in Roman Britannia. The Emperor Hadrian built Hadrian's Wall in the 2nd century, and that wall ended with a fort in Sagedunum, which was the original Latin name that was later brilliantly translated to Wall's End. And this will be significant later when we look at songs like All This Time, where Sting refers to the fact that when his family home was demolished years later, workers found an old Roman fort under the home, which spawned all kinds of creative ideas for Sting about history and the passage of time and cultures.
It's sad that they knocked the house down, but what they found underneath the house was a Roman fort. So it's kind of a rich area in terms of history and symbols.
Wallsend was known primarily as a shipbuilding industrial town. The Swan Hunter Company built the biggest ships in the world just down the street from Sting's childhood home. And most of the men that lived there worked in the shipyard. Sting's father had worked there, along with other family members dating back decades. His father left that job when he bought a dairy shop and became the milkman of the town. But young Gordon would watch the men walk to the shipyard every day and wonder if this was his future. So that's why you'll see all kinds of references to ships and the sea in his music, perhaps notably in his musical called The Last Ship. So when Sting is born, it's a predominantly Christian region and it's England, so it's majority Anglican, but there is a strong Catholic minority in the region, maybe up to a quarter of the population at that time. So obviously he's raised in a Christian culture, but you get the sense from his music and biographical details that there are lingering elements of Norse or pagan myths that are a part of this culture as well, especially in connection to seafaring and the kind of legends around the sea and faraway mythical islands. We'll go more in depth on this when we look at the Soul Cages album in a future video. So perhaps right from the start, Sting is influenced by the blending of Christian and older nature religions, which is a theme to which we will return a few times. Scholars often use the word syncretism to describe the phenomenon of different religious or cultural ideas blending together. And I'm just throwing out that concept now because it will come up in this series as we explore how Sting blends different ideas together, both religiously and musically. So his mother is Anglican, but his father is Catholic, and he's raised in the Catholic Church. It doesn't sound like an especially religious home in terms of Catholic practices, but his paternal grandmother, Agnes, was fairly devout, and she was also a housekeeper to a Catholic priest for many years. And Sting notes that this Father Jim almost felt like a member of the family when he was growing up. Agnes also loved books and exposed the young Gordon to reading and various types of books, and even had him read the Lives of the Saints at one point. It was not a happy home, certainly by Sting's own account in his memoir. A lot of the turmoil stemmed from the tumultuous relationship between his mother and his father. He tells the story in Broken Music that he once partially walked in on his mother while she was with another man. And she would eventually elope with this man, but it didn't work out. And then she came back. Sting's father was devastated by this, but he could never express his emotions. And the house was marked by a kind of silent depression for most of Sting's youth. He has also admitted that this distorted his relationship with women, requiring much psychological work later in life. Now, sadly, both of his parents died in their 50s, both of cancer and within months of each other. But as we'll see, both his mother and his father each inspired an album as Sting processed his grief through music. Nonetheless, growing up, he was involved in the church. He took part in the sacraments as a child, baptism, First Communion as a kid, confirmation as a teenager. And this was all at St. Columba's Catholic Church in Wallsend, a parish that was connected to St. Columba's Catholic School that he went to as a kid. In the Sting and Religion book, Marienberg uncovers something interesting in his research at the Diocese of Hexham and Newcastle, and that is that Sting's chosen confirmation name was Thomas. There's a tradition in Catholicism related to the sacrament of confirmation, where the person being confirmed chooses a kind of spiritual name, usually of a saint or biblical figure, and it would be someone who is inspiring or is a role model for the person being confirmed. To pick Thomas would be a very rare choice for a confirmation name. Most people would pick Paul or Peter or well-known saints like Francis of Assisi, or young women often pick Saint Joan of Arc or figures like that. Thomas, of course, is one of Jesus's apostles, but he's perhaps best known as Doubting Thomas, because he doubted that Jesus had risen from the dead. It wasn't until he saw and touched Jesus that he believed. He couldn't believe it on faith alone, in other words. In a 2017 email exchange with Marienberg, Sting notes that his paternal grandfather's name was Thomas, so that was part of the choice, but he did affirm that it was also a nod to Thomas the Apostle. As Sting put it in the interview, "I always thought that Thomas's initial skepticism was reasonable in the circumstances." So the fact that Sting chose Thomas as his confirmation name at 13 years old tells you something right away about his religious sensibilities and sort of foreshadows what is to come in his music. Gordon was an altar boy, and he notes in his memoir that the pomp and ceremony of the Mass appealed to the performer in him. In a 2018 interview with the National Catholic Register, he says, "I was an altar boy and I learned the Latin Mass, but I loved plain song. I loved Gregorian chant, the sung Mass. I still think I carry some of those cadences in my composition when I compose, so I'm grateful for that." In his memoir, we read that after he quits his teaching job and is struggling to make it as a musician, he has many anxious nights where he wakes up and resorts to praying the rosary. He notes that he was comforted by this and that the repetition of the prayers turns into a kind of soothing mantra. In an interview with Marienberg, he notes that he would say the rosary constantly as a kid, just walking to school or whenever he had anxiety. And he notes here too, in connection to the Hail Mary, that even as a child, he found it easier to connect with feminine images of God. And here you see some theological sophistication and anger at the church, as he says that the church engaged in a, quote, patriarchal and misogynistic purge throughout its history as it replaced all the ancient forms of goddess worship with an exclusively male image of God. By the way, if you want a classic book on this, check out She Who Is by Elizabeth Johnson. Nonetheless, Sting's point is that at least the church kept Mary as a central figure, and he sees the church's veneration of Mary as a dimension of the church that he really connected with. And then he says here in his memoir that Mary, the Star of the Sea, had become his icon as a child. So let's go a little deeper on this point. The figure of Mary has lots of titles, obviously the Virgin Mary or God-bearer or the new Eve, for example. But one ancient title, certainly one that Catholics who live near large bodies of water know, is Mary, the Star of the Sea, which in Latin is Stella Maris. This has a fascinating origin, and what's funny about it is that the title is likely based on a translation mistake. Basically, Mary is Miriam in Hebrew, and then Miriam or Maria in Greek. And when the 4th century bishop and historian Eusebius of Caesarea was commenting on Mary, he claimed that the original Hebrew meaning of Miriam was drop of the sea, or in Latin, stilla maris. Now, this was probably incorrect, as the name in Hebrew means something more like beloved or bitter or a combination thereof, depending on who you're reading. But Eusebius took the mar part to mean sea, as in marine. And this idea gets picked up in the tradition, certainly by St. Jerome, when he writes a book in the 4th century that explains the Hebrew meanings of Old Testament names. And then, at some point in church history, someone copying this book of names by St. Jerome makes a mistake with the word stilla, which means drop, and he writes stella, which means star. So stilla accidentally turned into stella. But like many other things in the history of religions, this little error sticks and hits on something deeply symbolic for many early Christians, especially around the Mediterranean. And then, of course, later for Sting's ancestors in what would become Britain. Stella Maris is adopted by seafaring cultures that live near the sea, as if to say, just as a star guides sailors home, Mary guides souls towards Christ. Now, if you are a sailor or even just a terrified passenger on a ship back in the day, this is going to be a very powerful and visceral image, even archetypal in terms of the sea in its depth and danger and the protection of the mother and so on. Mary is the light and guide through the stormy waters. Or as Saint Bernard of Clairvaux put it in the 11th century, if winds of temptation arise, if you are driven upon the rocks of tribulation, look to the star, call on Mary. So Sting writes in his memoir, Mary, the star of the sea, became my icon as a child, floating above the ocean in her blue veil, her head ringed by stars and tilted gently to one side, her eyes modestly downcast as if in thought. Her smile was delicate, Venusian, and held the promise of infinite patience and compassion. She was a being who could intercede for me in the court of heaven. My favorite childhood hymn had ended, Virgin most pure star of the sea, pray for the wanderer, pray for me. Mary resurfaces throughout Sting's music. In the intro video, I mentioned how the Nothing Like the Sun album is largely about Sting grappling with his feminine aspects after his mother has died. And the back of the album has this picture of him with a statue of Mary. You can hear a reference to Star of the Sea in the song Valparaiso, which is about a ship journey through or below Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. Think of his Winter album, which includes the 15th century song There Is No Rose of Such Virtue, which is a song about Mary. It also has Gabriel's Message and Bethlehem Down, which reference Mary. Also in the song St. Augustine in Hell, which is about being tempted by a woman who belongs to a friend. He says, Blessed St. Teresa, the whore of Babylon, Madonna, and my mother all rolled into one. Now, he adds in his memoir, though, that in his later years, with deeper questioning of religion, he would struggle with the idea of the virgin birth, mostly because of its implications for sexuality. Sting was wondering, in his own words, why, having created the miraculous and sacred mechanism of sex, God would see fit to bypass it in order to send Christ into the world untainted by his own invention. It just seems like one miracle too many. And here we foreshadow a future video episode on the theme of spirituality and sex. So in the song Sacred Love, for example, when he says, I've been thinking about religion, I've been thinking about the things that we believe, these are the kinds of theological questions he's grappling with around sexuality. So the young Gordon attends St. Columba's primary school, and as he says in his memoir, it was at St. Columba's that I began my lifelong fascination with religion and conversely my lifelong problem with it. His first problem was the way that the Catholic faith was taught. Especially before the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, the church usually relied heavily on the catechism for teaching kids. Now, the Catechism is a sort of summary of all Catholic teachings, and it can be a valuable resource for looking up official church teachings. But many would argue it's not really an appropriate way to teach the faith on its own, especially to kids and teenagers. The Catechism is basically just propositional statements. There's no real narrative or thought-provoking questions or any sense of the mystery of the faith. Remember that Jesus himself taught in parables, right? Not dogmatic statements. And so the church tended to just make kids memorize doctrines and teachings by reading through the different sections of the catechism. Or the teacher would ask a question and the students would have to repeat back the proper answer. He says, all Catholic school children are taught the catechism, a little red book from which we are indoctrinated and expected to memorize verbatim like proto-Maoists about to convert the world. Who made you? The teacher asks. God made me. Why did God make you? To know him, love him, and serve him. In whose likeness did God make you? In his own likeness, etc., etc. And Sting goes on, implicit in all of this was that God was Catholic and that anyone who wasn't Catholic would not be able to enter the kingdom of heaven and ought to be pitied or, if at all possible, converted to the true church. He then says that he couldn't really accept this idea, in part because his mom wasn't even Catholic, and the idea of heaven and hell and purgatory seemed like strange concepts to him. He says at one point that the teachers described heaven in such a way that made it seem like an endless, boring mass. He continues noting that since he had never really had a religious experience, he always felt like an imposter. He also talks about his issues with the sacrament of confession. The church had long had the idea that 7 years old is the age of reason. This is an old idea from Aquinas and even back to Aristotle. And therefore, this is a good time to introduce the idea of confessing your sins. I think in its ideal form, teaching children to develop their consciences and to be able to name the mistakes they made and, be forgiven so you can move on. This can be a positive thing for kids as they develop. In reality, though, many Catholics will report negative experiences when they reflect back on childhood confessions. I would say partly because of the church's obsession with sex as the most important category of sin, but also just the general problem of being pressured to come up with sins just to have something to say to the priest. And this is certainly the case for Sting, who writes, as far as I was concerned, I hadn't committed any sins to speak of, but was too embarrassed to tell the priest that I was sinless, so the first statement that I had sinned was in itself a lie. I would then have to compound the lie by making up a catalog of venial misdemeanors like I have been disobedient, I hadn't, or I have told lies, where the only lies I had been involved in had been told at my last confession within the sanctity of the sacrament, compounding the lie with a sacrilege, which of course carried the penalty of eternal torment. This terrifying ontological conundrum and moral paradox was frankly too much for my 7-year-old brain, so I avoided confession like the plague, which of course made matters even worse. He goes on to say that he just didn't want to do this anymore, and so he had already sort of accepted, even as a kid, that he wasn't really a true member of the church. As he puts it, either I was a very stupid 7-year-old or I was overthinking things. He concludes this section with this line, I've carried such conundrums well into adult life, and sometimes they have served me well and other times they have not, but thought and torment seem to be inextricably linked, and this is the lasting legacy of my Catholicism. So at age 11, he moves on from St. Columba's to St. Cuthbert's Grammar School, where he will be from the age of 11 to 18. Now, most notable from this section of his memoir are his occasional meetings with Father Walsh, where he would be caned. Yes, hit with a cane for various offenses in the school. And here we see the darker side of the Catholic Church and get a sense of where his disdain for the institutional aspects of the church come from. He notes that one year he held the record for receiving a total of 42 cane lashings, by which he means 6 consecutive lashes on 7 different occasions. He describes in vivid detail waiting outside of Father Walsh's office with other students who had done something wrong. He never really says why he was sent to the office, but he does say in general that students were caned for silly minor things like being late or talking back or fighting or that sort of thing. My suspicion is that he was questioning church doctrine in class. Describing the cane lashings, he writes, "The man on the crucifix by the window averts his eyes from the torture. Is this really being done in his name?" He then says, no matter how tough you think you are, by the fourth lash you're crying, and if it's not from the pain, then it's from the rage that you're feeling. And he ends this account with the following line: "Any idea that I would become an unquestioning and non-critical follower of the church's wisdom flew out of the office window as the final swipe found its target at the seat of my resentment." So you get a better sense now of when he sings things like, you could say, "I lost my belief in the Holy Church." This is one of the reasons why. Overall, Sting will talk about both the positive and negative aspects of his experience in the church growing up. In one of his interviews with Marienberg, he explains that there was a kind of unspoken but very clear divide in his school between more liberal priests and more conservative priests. Sting clearly had many excellent lay and religious teachers who were intellectually rigorous and offered a different side of Catholicism other than the caning and rote memorization. They were exposed to thinkers like John Henry Newman and the concept of the development of doctrine, just the idea that the church's understanding of their doctrines can evolve over time in light of new knowledge. At St. Cuthbert's, they were exposed to Catholic social teaching as some of the priests taught the principles of the Catholic worker movement, which was a sort of left-leaning workers' rights movement. These aspects of Catholicism emphasize social and economic justice and biblical themes about poverty and liberation. Marienberg also notes that these students would have been exposed to the French movement known as the worker priest movement, which encouraged priests to get involved and actually work in blue-collar jobs in factories, for example. Decades later, Sting will write a musical called The Last Ship, which is about a shipyard that is closed down because of economic downturn. And the workers defiantly lock themselves in the shipyard to finish the ship. And at least in the original version of the play, it's a Catholic priest that helps to lead the group in this effort. So you can see a direct line from that story back to learning about Catholic social teaching in Catholic schools. And of course, while Sting is at St. Cuthbert's, as a teenager, the Second Vatican Council happens. So this is essentially a series of big conferences at the Vatican where all of the bishops and church leaders of the world meet from 1962 to 1965 to discuss the church and its teachings and its place in the modern world. One of the general shifts that occurs with Vatican II is that the church evolves in its disposition towards the modern world. Rather than an antagonistic church versus society mentality, and a sense that modernity is evil, the church begins to see itself as involved in the modern world. That it not only has something to offer the world, but it has something to learn from the secular world as well, from science, from social movements, and just the collective experience of human history. Now, Sting does live through this transition, but the developments of Vatican II take time to actually be implemented. So while he would have experienced things like the Mass changing from Latin to English, probably later in high school, I think we would still have to say that his formative years in the church are very much marked by the pre-Vatican II ethos. However, I would add that I get the sense from the research that the revolutionary spirit of the time is felt at his school in this tension between the different types of priests and teachers at St. Cuthbert's. Sting will then go to a teacher's college after various odd jobs for a few years, and he becomes a teacher at St. Paul's First School in Cramlington for a couple of years in the mid-1970s. He teaches various subjects, but I think with an emphasis on English. which is significant given the numerous literary references in his music that we will touch on throughout this series. In terms of religious identity into adulthood, it appears that he is still a practicing Catholic when he is a teacher. He notes in an interview with Marion Berg that when he marries his first wife, Frances Tomelty, in 1976, that they got married at a popular chapel, and he mentions that the only reason they were allowed to have their ceremony there was because they went there each week. And they baptized their first child in the Catholic Church as well. So at least at that point, he's still a practicing Catholic. It seems that after this time period, like many people who were born and raised Catholic, the slow drift away from the church begins to happen. Add to that by the late 1970s, the Police are becoming world famous, and I suspect his subsequent divorce from his wife in the early 80s doesn't help his relationship with the church, given how divorced Catholics were often treated at that time. My sense is that, again, like many Catholics, there is no definitive break with the church, but it's just a sort of gradual process of drifting away. I'm thinking of Bill Burr's stand-up routine here about his gradual departure from the church, and he likens it to a curler throwing a curling rock down the ice.
You know that moment where the shooter, whatever you call him, is just sliding with that rock, right? Just that rock just keeps going, and this dude just stops. That's what I did with my religion. I just let go of it. I didn't read a riot act to anybody. I just let go of it. And on the third day, he rose again in fulfillment of I just floated away.
In the last couple of decades, on the rare occasion that an interviewer asks about his religious identity, Sting tends to say things to the effect that he has chosen not to live his life with the certainties of religion. He has discussed having religious experiences, but this is in the context of psychedelic experiences, such as with ayahuasca or peyote, which we'll definitely talk about later in this series. He has also described himself for many years as a devout musician, arguing that a disciplined devotion to music and songwriting is his way of connecting with the transcendent and to mystery.
You say in the book that when asked your religion, you write devout musician, which is kind of interesting. Does that mean you pray to Angus Young every day, or how does that work out?
It's not a frivolous answer. You know, my spiritual path involves music. I'm essentially agnostic, which I think means I don't know. And I've chosen to live my life without the so-called certainties of religious faith. I think they're dangerous, actually. And I don't have a problem with God, I have a problem with religion. And so I think being a devout musician is a serious answer. I think it's something that gives my life value, and it does give me spiritual solace.
And at times when pressed, he has referred to himself as agnostic. As he told The Hollywood Reporter in 2013, "I'm not an atheist. Probably agnostic is a reasonable term in that it means I don't know." But then he adds, "I can kneel down and say, thank you for including me in this incredible miracle." The interviewer, sensing that Sting is more than just an agnostic, questions him and pushes back. "I can't really believe that you are not in some way a theist, that you don't really believe in some extra physical force, intelligence, consciousness that exists beyond our senses." And then in a classic ambiguous Sting response, he says, "I think there's a possibility that's the case. I don't want to be a poster boy for it, but yeah, I'll agree." In the next video, we'll continue our examination of Sting's religious identity. We'll look at his 2018 musical project with the Vatican, and we'll try to make sense of what we just reviewed in this video in terms of his relationship with Catholicism. And I'll suggest that Andrew Greeley's idea of the Catholic imagination can help us understand Sting's ambiguous relationship with religion. My name is Mike, and this is Neon Gods. Like, subscribe, and join me on the next video for Sting Religion and the Meaning of Life.